The whole town of Harding Creek said Seth Barnett had not smiled in 7 years, and the widow, Clary Hobbs, who had lived in that dusty corner of West Texas since before the railroad came through, swore on her late husband's Bible that the man had forgotten how. Lydia Atwood heard this particular warning on the same Tuesday morning in April of 1882 that her wagon wheels finally rolled off the packed Caliche Road and onto the rutted lane leading to the Barnett spread. She heard it from the freighter named Hob Dunnigan, who had been kind enough to drive her and her 2 trunks out from town after her hired coach broke an axle 3 miles shy of the ranch. Hob was a barrel-chested man with a gray beard that reached his collar, and he delivered the warning with the matter-of-fact gravity of a man reading from Scripture. "You understand what you are walking into, Miss Atwood," he said, clicking his tongue at the mules. "Seth Barnett lost his wife and his boy in a fever winter back in '75. Then a horse fire took half his face in '78. Man has not had a reason to smile since, by most accounts, and he has gone out of his way to keep it that way. Runs off hired hands who get too friendly. Ate his Christmas dinner alone 3 years running. His own sister stopped visiting after he told her the ranch was not a social club." Lydia tucked a loose strand of chestnut hair back beneath the brim of her sunbonnet and studied the land rolling out before her. It was beautiful in the harsh, unapologetic way of West Texas in spring. Bluebonnets ran in pale rivers through the dry grass. A hawk turned slow circles over a distant ridge. The air smelled of cedar and warm earth and the faint mineral bite of a creek somewhere below. "I appreciate the warning, Mr. Dunnigan," she said pleasantly. "But I was hired as his ranch housekeeper and cook, not as his companion. I do not need him to smile at me," Hobbs snorted. "You have not seen the man yet." He was right, of course. She had corresponded with Seth Barnett by letter for 3 weeks before agreeing to the position. The letters had been brief and functional, stating clearly that the ranch needed someone to manage the household, prepare meals for himself and 2 ranch hands, maintain the kitchen garden, and keep the books orderly. The wage offered was fair, the accommodations were described as adequate, and not a single personal word had been included beyond a formal signature. She had taken the job because she needed it. She was 26 years old. She had just buried her father in Abilene after a year of nursing him through consumption, and she had precisely $11.40 to her name. The wagon crested a low rise and the Barnett ranch spread out below them, and Lydia found herself sitting up straighter despite herself. It was not a grand place. The main house was a single-story structure of weathered cedar plank, wide-porched and solid-looking, set back from a working yard where a water trough, a wood pile, and a chicken coop occupied their respective corners. Beyond it stood a good-sized barn, a corral holding 4 horses, and the long, low shape of a bunkhouse. A garden bed ran along the south side of the house, somewhat overgrown but clearly once well-tended. The whole property had the look of something that had been cared for deeply and then neglected, not from laziness but from a grief too heavy to carry alongside ordinary life. A man was standing at the corral fence when the wagon rolled into the yard. He had his back to them, watching a roan gelding pace the far rail, and he did not turn at the sound of the wheels. He was tall, lean through the shoulders in the way of men who work hard and eat only what they need. He wore a dark canvas jacket and plain trousers, and the back of his neck where his collar did not reach was sun-bronzed and straight. Hob brought the mules to a stop and set the brake with a clatter that would have woken the dead. The man at the corral still did not turn. Lydia climbed down from the wagon seat before Hob could offer a hand, which she could tell surprised him. She smoothed her skirt, adjusted her bonnet, and walked across the yard with her boot heels finding the hard ground with a deliberate, unhurried step. She came up alongside the corral and rested her forearms on the top rail, leaving 2 feet of space between herself and the man, and looked at the roan gelding. "He is favoring his right foreleg," she said. "Near the knee, you can see it in how he turns." The man turned then. The scar ran from just beneath his left eye, down across the cheek in a wide, uneven sweep, pulling slightly at the corner of his mouth, and continuing along the jaw to the line of his neck. It was old enough to have settled into the skin rather than standing proud of it, a landscape of healed damage that fire leaves behind. His right side was unmarked, and that side of his face was sharply formed, strong-jawed, with dark eyes beneath a straight brow. Those eyes were the color of creek water over slate, and they looked at her with no warmth and no welcome, and with a directness that most men in her experience had never quite managed. "You are the housekeeper," he said. It was not a question. "Lydia Atwood," she said, "and you are Mr. Barnett." "Seth," he said, because apparently he drew the line at formality somewhere, and then he looked back at the horse. "The leg has been looked at. It will do." "I am sure it will," she said, and did not press the matter. There was a silence between them that she had the sense he expected her to fill with nervous chatter. She did not fill it. She watched the roan for another moment, then straightened and walked back to where Hob was unloading her trunks from the wagon bed with considerable effort. "I will take the smaller one," she told Hob, picking up the lighter trunk herself. "Mr. Barnett, if you could tell me which room I will be using, I will get myself settled and have supper started within the hour." Seth Barnett stared at her with those slate-colored eyes for a count of 3 seconds. "Door on the left inside. Room at the end of the hall." He paused. "Supper is at 6. 6 it is," she said, and carried her trunk up the porch steps and through the front door. Inside, the house was dim and clean in the way of a place that had no clutter because it had no softness. There were no curtains on the windows, no rug on the plank floor, no pictures on the walls. The parlor held 2 straight-back chairs and a small writing table. The kitchen was better equipped than she had expected: a good cast-iron stove, a solid work table, shelves of canned goods and dry staples. But the whole place had a held-breath quality, as if it had been waiting for someone to come in and let the air move again. The room at the end of the hall was small and plain, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a single window that looked out onto the kitchen garden. There was a hook on the back of the door and a braided rag rug on the floor that was the only piece of softness she had seen in the whole house. She set her trunk down, unpinned her bonnet, and pressed her palms flat on the washstand and looked at herself in the small mirror above it. "Well," she said quietly, "you have worked with difficult men before." She had, in fact. Her father had been a difficult man in the particular way of men who love you fiercely and show it only in argument. She had cooked and kept house for him for 4 years after her mother passed, managing his tempers and his silences in equal measure, and she had learned that silence was not the same as absence, and that a man who did not speak his feelings was not necessarily a man who did not have them. She unpacked what she needed, rolled up her sleeves, and went to make supper. The pantry revealed dried beans, salt pork, cornmeal, a tin of molasses, and a good supply of smoked jerky. She found dried chilies hanging in a bundle above the back door and a half-sack of onions in the corner, and she made a judgment call. She soaked nothing, because time did not allow it, but she put the salt pork on first, and while it rendered, she sliced the onions thin and let them go soft and gold in the fat, then added reconstituted beans from a can. She had found a case of them on the bottom shelf: chilies, salt, and enough water to let it all come together into something better than the sum of its parts. She found a skillet and made cornbread, which was in the oven when the 2 ranch hands came in from the south pasture just past 5:30. They were young men, both in their early 20s, one broad and fair-haired named Chester, and one slight and dark-haired named Ruiz, who she learned quickly was formerly Emilio Ruiz, out of San Antonio by way of a cattle drive that had ended in this county. They both came through the kitchen door with the stamping, hat-removing, vaguely apologetic energy of young men who had been warned to behave. "You must be the new cook," Chester said, hat already in his hands. "And housekeeper," she said. "Lydia Atwood. Supper will be ready in 20 minutes. There is water in the trough out back for washing up." Ruiz looked at the pot on the stove and then at her with an expression of cautious hope. "Is that chili con carne?" "Near enough," she said. His face broke into a smile of such genuine relief that she laughed. "When is the last time you had a decent supper, Mr. Ruiz?" "It has been," he said carefully, "some time." Chester nodded with great solemnity. "Mr. Barnett cooks about 4 things, and they are all the same thing." "Chester," Ruiz said, with a tone that suggested the boss might be within earshot. "I will not repeat it," Lydia assured them both, and went back to the cornbread. Seth came in at 6 on the precise minute, washed his hands at the kitchen basin without being asked, and sat at the head of the table in the way of a man who has been sitting at the head of a table alone for long enough that the habit is deeply carved. He looked at the food Lydia set out, the pot of beans and pork, the pan of cornbread, a jar of pickled okra she had found at the back of the pantry, with an expression she could not quite read. He said grace. It was short, 2 sentences, but it was said, and she noted that too. The first meal was eaten largely in silence, but it was the comfortable silence of hungry people eating good food, not the hostile silence she had half expected. Chester ate 3 portions and looked like he might weep from happiness. Ruiz ate 2 and stared at the pot with the expression of a man making calculations. Seth ate his portion steadily and said nothing until he set his fork down. "It is good," he said. "Thank you," she said. He stood, nodded once to the table, and went outside. She heard him on the porch for a while, the sound of a man standing in the dark after supper, which she imagined was a habit of long standing. Chester collected the plates with a helpfulness that was clearly his natural state, and Ruiz dried them when she washed. And in this way, the first evening at the Barnett Ranch concluded without incident and with everyone fed, which she counted as a reasonable beginning. She lay awake for a while that night listening to the sound of the Texas darkness, which was not truly silent. There were coyotes at a distance, and the horses shifting in the corral, and once the low creak of the porch boards outside that told her Seth Barnett was still out there, standing alone under the stars in a habit she suspected was the closest thing he had to peace. She thought about the scar, not in the way of someone cataloging a disfigurement, but in the way of someone trying to understand a story. A horse fire in 1878, 4 years ago now. She thought about what it would mean to carry that on your face every day, to see every stranger's eyes go to it and either stare or look quickly away, to know that you were being read first and seen second. She thought about his wife and his boy and the fever winter of 1875, 7 years of grief. She had thought when Hobb described it that it sounded like a man who had chosen bitterness. Lying here now, having shared 1 meal and a handful of words with the man, she was less certain of that. She thought it sounded more like a man who had simply run out of reasons. She decided, not in any dramatic fashion but in the quiet, practical way she made most of her decisions, that she would give him reasons without requiring him to ask for them. She started in the morning. The kitchen garden was her first project. She rose before 6, while the dark was still thick and the stars were still burning, dressed quickly, and went out with a lantern to assess. The garden had been planted intelligently. She could see the old logic of it, the rows for herbs along the south wall, the deeper beds for root vegetables, the space for tomatoes and peppers. Someone had loved this garden. Someone had stopped loving it. The weeds had come in thick but not irretrievably, and the soil where she scraped her boot through it was still good and dark. She was deep in the first row with a hand hoe when the light changed, and she became aware of someone watching her from the direction of the barn. She kept working. After a moment she heard boots on the dry ground and Seth Barnett came and stood at the garden's edge. "What are you doing?" he said. It was not quite a question either, just a statement searching for its answer. "Reclaiming the beds," she said. "There was good growing here. The soil is still worth working. I found some volunteer tomatoes along the east edge, see that? They came up on their own from last year's seeds, tough little things." He looked at the garden with an expression she was beginning to recognize as the face he made when something surprised him, and he was deciding whether to allow that surprise to register. "That was my wife's garden," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. The early light was gray and kind. "I know," she said, because she had guessed as much from the care of its original layout. "Do you want me to leave it?" The question was genuine. She would leave it if he asked. She would let the weeds have it and plan her cooking around the pantry stocks and say no more about it. He was quiet for a long moment. A rooster somewhere in the direction of the chicken coop began to declare the morning. "No," he said at last. "Do what you like with it." He went to the barn. She went back to weeding. She learned the rhythms of the ranch in the first week the way she had always learned things, by watching and listening and asking practical questions that had practical answers. She learned that Chester was responsible for the remuda and the fences along the north pasture, and that Ruiz handled the cattle work and the south range, and that Seth did everything that needed doing in between and a great deal else besides. She learned that he rose at 4:30 every morning and was in the barn by 5, and that he came in for meals reliably but never early, and that he spent his evenings on the porch or at the writing table going over the account books with a focused, methodical attention that told her the ranch's survival was a thing he took with absolute seriousness. She asked him at the end of the first week if she could look at the accounts. He looked at her over the edge of the ledger. "Why?" "Because you said keeping the books was part of the position, and because I am good at it," she said. "My father kept a dry goods store. I ran the accounts for 3 years." Another one of those silences in which she could not tell if he was deciding to trust her or deciding how to refuse her. Then he turned the ledger around and pushed it across the writing table toward her. She pulled the other chair up and sat across from him in the lamplight and read through 2 months of figures with the steady concentration of someone who enjoys numbers, which she did. "You are carrying more feed cost than you need to," she said, after a while. "You are buying from Greer's in town when the Vasquez mill on the road to Sanderson sells the same grade for 2 cents less a pound, and they will deliver in quantities over 50 pounds. Seth looked at her. "Also," she said, "you have not charged Chester and Ruiz for their board and keep, which you are allowed to under the terms of their hire, and if you do, it partially offsets the feed difference. Not that you have to," she added, because she was not about to tell him how to run his ranch. "But it is an option." He took the ledger back and looked at the figures she had pointed to, and she watched him follow the arithmetic and reach the same conclusion she had reached, and she saw something shift in his face, not warmth exactly, but the first faint loosening of the set rigidity he wore like armor. "I will send word to Vasquez's on Monday," he said. "I can write the letter if you like," she said. "I have a clean hand." He nodded. She wrote the letter. It was a small thing, but she had learned that trust between cautious people is built entirely of small things laid one atop another until they have enough height to stand on. The second week she put curtains in the kitchen windows. She had found fabric in a cedar chest in the hall, a bolt of blue calico that had not been touched in years, and she sewed them in the evenings by lamplight. She had expected some reaction when she hung them, some objection or pointed silence, but Seth looked at the curtains when he came in for breakfast and said nothing for a long moment and then said, "Blue was her color," and sat down to eat. "I can take them down," Lydia said. "No," he said, and picked up his coffee cup with both hands, and that was the end of it. She began to understand that he was not a man without feeling. He was a man in whom feeling had been driven so deep by loss that it had nowhere easy to surface, and what came out instead was the blunt, functional language of a man managing a working ranch. He told her when supplies ran low. He told her when he expected to be out late and she should not wait on supper. He told her once, after she made a pie from dried apricots she had found in the pantry, that it was the best thing he had eaten in a year and a half, which was so unexpectedly specific that she had to turn back to the stove to hide her smile. Chester and Ruiz were an education in themselves. Chester was from a farm family in Ohio who had come west on a kind of adventure that had not yet resolved itself into anything purposeful beyond the fact that he was good with horses and cheerful in all weather. Ruiz had a more complicated story that he parceled out in small pieces. A grandfather who had ranched this land when it was still Mexican territory. a father who had lost it to a land judgment that Ruiz described with a careful evenness that did not quite conceal the old burn beneath it. He spoke to Lydia sometimes in Spanish when he forgot himself, and she answered back in the serviceable Spanish she had learned from Mexican traders in Abilene, which pleased him visibly. At the end of the second week, Chester broke a spoke in the wagon wheel, bringing it back from the east pasture, and the whole wheel needed replacing. Seth had the iron and the tools, but the work required someone to hold the wheel true while the new spoke was fitted and seated, and with Ruiz out with the cattle, the options were Seth, Chester, and Lydia. She held the wheel. It was heavy, awkward work, and her arms ached with it by the time the spoke was set, but she held it without complaint and followed Seth's terse instructions with the same practical attention she brought to everything. When it was done and the wheel was remounted and Chester was rolling the wagon back into the shed, Seth stood and looked at her for a moment with an unreadable expression. "You did not have to do that," he said. "You needed someone to hold it," she said simply. He handed her the rag he had been using to wipe the grease from his hands, and she took it and cleaned her own palms, and for a moment they stood together in the warm afternoon shade of the barn, and the silence between them had a different quality from the silences before it. It was easier somehow, less defended. "You have done ranch work before," he said. "Some," she said. "My father sold goods to ranchers for 20 years. I helped where I could." "Your father is gone. This past winter," she said. "Consumption." He nodded slowly, and she had the sense that he understood grief in a way that did not require elaboration or sympathy, that he simply recognized it as the geography you carry when someone is gone, the way you keep walking in the space they used to occupy. "I am sorry," he said, and he meant it, and she could hear that he meant it. "Thank you," she said. That evening at supper Seth told them that Vasquez's mill had sent word they would deliver the first order on Friday. Chester wanted to know if that meant less driving to town, and Seth said yes, and Chester looked modestly pleased in the way of someone who did not especially enjoy the drive to Harding Creek. Ruiz said nothing but gave Lydia a look of quiet acknowledgment that she accepted with an equally quiet nod. After supper, while Lydia was finishing the dishes, she heard something from the parlor that it took her a moment to identify. It was the sound of a chair moving, and then of pages turning Seth at his account books, which was normal, but underneath that, very quietly, a tuneless kind of sound. It was not quite humming. It was more like the sound a man makes when he is so deeply absorbed in something that he forgets to be guarded, the half-involuntary music of a mind at ease. She smiled at the dishwater and said nothing. The third week brought a problem in the form of a letter. It came with the Friday delivery from Vasquez's, tucked into the order papers by the driver who said it had been left at the mill for passing on to the Barnett spread. Seth read it at the kitchen table while Lydia poured his coffee, and she saw his face go still in a particular way that was different from his ordinary stillness. He set the letter down on the table and pressed both palms flat against the wood, a gesture she had come to recognize as the way he held himself together when something hit him hard. "Trouble?" she asked, not intrusively, but not pretending she had not noticed. "My neighbor to the east," he said, "man named Cullen Price. He is claiming that the creek that runs through the south pasture belongs to his land under a water rights survey he has had done. He is saying I am using his water." Lydia set the coffee pot down. "When was your deed filed?" He looked at her. 71. "And when did he acquire his land?" "He bought from the Alderman estate in 78. "Then your water access predates his by 7 years," she said. "Prior appropriation. It is a settled point in Texas water law, first in time, first in right. If he filed that survey after you were already using the creek, it does not supersede your established use." Seth stared at her. It was a different kind of staring than he had done before. This had something startled in it. "My father had a surveying dispute in Abilene," she explained, a little dryly. "I read everything I could find about property law. I had a great deal of time in the evenings." He looked at the letter again and then back at her. "How certain are you?" "Fairly certain," she said. but you should speak to an attorney in Harding Creek to confirm it. I believe there is one Mr. Falk, I was told, on the main street above the hardware store." "Falk," he said and nodded. "I know Falk." He rode to town the next morning, and he was back by midday, and when he came in for the noon meal, his posture had something released in it. He sat down at the table and poured his own coffee for the first time she had seen him do, and he said, "Falk confirms it. He says Price was likely hoping I did not know the law." "People often hope that," Lydia said. "Falk said he will draft a letter to Price's attorney," Seth said, "and that it will be settled without going before a judge." He looked at her then, and the look had a weight to it that she felt in her chest. "That was good thinking," he said. "It was good reading," she said, and set his plate in front of him. But she felt the warmth of it all afternoon, the simple, uncomplicated pleasure of being useful to a person who needed using. It was not a complicated feeling, but it sat in her with a steadiness that surprised her a little, because she had not expected this place to feel like anything in particular. She had expected it to be employment. She had not expected it to begin to feel, tentatively and quietly and with no permission asked or granted, like something she might want to stay in. By the 4th week, she had the garden producing the first of the spring greens, and she began supplementing the pantry stores with fresh food. She put lettuce on the table and radishes and the first small onions from the volunteer bed, and Chester looked at the fresh salad with an expression of reverence. Ruiz ate his in silence and then said quietly, "My grandmother grew radishes," and did not say more than that, but the way he said it told her everything about how long he had been away from home. Seth ate everything she put before him with the consistent, focused appreciation of a man who had gone too long eating food that was just fuel. She noticed that he had begun, sometimes, to look at the table before he sat down, as if checking to see what was there, which was a small change from the way he had looked at nothing in particular when she first arrived. She was hanging the week's washing on the line behind the house one morning, when she heard the sound of a wagon coming up the lane at a faster pace than usual, and the voice that came with it was female and sharp, and carrying the particular tone of a woman who has made a long drive and is not in a mood to be trifled with. The wagon that rolled into the yard held a woman of about 40, solidly built and red-faced from the sun, with light brown hair mostly captured under a practical hat, and a pair of eyes the same slate color as Seth Barnett's. She pulled the horses up sharply and looked around the yard and then at Lydia with an expression that was not unfriendly but was definitely appraising. "You must be the housekeeper," she said, which seemed to be the standard opening in this part of Texas. "I am Me Coulter, Seth's sister. Is he about?" "In the north pasture," Lydia said. "He should be back for the noon meal. You are welcome to come in." Me Coulter came in. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and watched Lydia work with the sharp-eyed directness of a woman, assessing a situation she has heard about secondhand and wants to evaluate for herself. She had driven out from her farm near Sanderson, which was a 2-hour trip, and she had clearly come with purpose. "He wrote me," Me said finally. "3rd letter in a year. Usually I am lucky to get one at Christmas." Lydia kept chopping. "That is good, I hope." "It is extraordinary," Me said frankly. "The last letter he wrote me before these said, and I quote, that the ranch was not a social club, so I am here to see what has changed." Lydia looked at her with the same directness Me was using. "I do not believe I have changed anything, Mrs. Coulter. I cook and keep the house and work the garden." Me looked at the blue curtains in the kitchen windows. She looked at the bowl of early greens on the work table and the clean orderliness of the shelves and the pot simmering on the stove. She looked at these things with an expression that was doing a great deal of quiet arithmetic. "He mentioned the water rights situation," Me said. "He said you helped." "I had useful information," Lydia said. "He did the hard part, going to town and speaking to the attorney." "He went to town," Me said slowly. "Voluntarily. He needed to see Falk." "Seth has needed to see Falk 3 times in 4 years," Me said, "and each time he found a reason not to go. Chester had to carry messages for him." She looked at Lydia. "You convinced him to go." I told him the law, Lydia said. He decided what to do with the information. Me set her coffee cup down and looked at Lydia Atwood with the expression of a woman who has been worried about someone for a very long time and has just seen the first credible sign that things might be turning. Her eyes, those slate eyes, had a brightness in them that she was clearly managing carefully. He is my only brother, me said, simply and quietly. He has been gone from himself for a long time. I have not known how to reach him. I am glad somebody has. I have not reached him, Lydia said honestly. We are cordial. He is a private man. He is the most private man in West Texas, me agreed. But private is not the same as unreachable. It just requires patience. Lydia thought privately that she had patience in considerable supply. Seth came in for the noon meal and stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw his sister, and there was a beat of something that she recognized from a distance as complicated emotion held at bay. Then Me stood up and crossed the kitchen and put her arms around her brother with the unsentimental firmness of a woman who is not going to argue about whether this is allowed. And after a moment, Seth's arms came up and he held her back, and Lydia busied herself with great concentration at the stove. She heard him say, very quietly, "Me." "Seth," Me said, "you look better than I expected." "I look the same," he said. "You do not," Me said, and pulled back to look at him. "You look like someone who has been eating regular meals." Lydia, still at the stove, allowed herself a very small smile. They had a good noon meal, the four of them. Ruiz was out with the cattle and Chester had taken a fence repair to the north end. And Me had a gift for conversation that pulled things out of Seth the way a good current draws debris from a still pool. She talked about her husband Thomas and the farm and their 3 children, and she asked Seth about the cattle and the water rights situation, and the ranch accounts with the frank curiosity of a woman who had grown up in this business. And Seth answered with more words than Lydia had heard from him in the previous 4 weeks combined. Watching them together, she understood something she had only half seen before. He was not a man who had closed himself to affection. He was a man who had been waiting, perhaps without fully knowing it, for the world to offer him something safe enough to open toward. Me stayed for the afternoon and left before evening, and at the gate she pulled Lydia aside while Seth went to help her with the horses and said quietly, "He has not talked that much since before his boy died. I want you to know what that means. Whatever you are doing, please keep doing it." Lydia said, "I am just cooking supper." Me looked at her with a knowing expression and said nothing more, and drove away up the lane in the golden afternoon light. That evening Seth did not go immediately to the porch after supper. He sat at the kitchen table while Lydia cleaned up, and there was a quality to his presence that was new, something opened. After a while he said, "Me says you told her I look better." "I said you had been eating regularly," Lydia said, keeping her voice easy. "She has been worried about me," he said. "She loves you," Lydia said. There was a silence. Outside the kitchen window, the last of the day was burning gold against the ridge. "My son's name was Daniel," he said, and nothing else. Just the name offered into the room. She stopped what she was doing and turned and looked at him. And she did not say she was sorry, because she had said it once and he knew she meant it, and she did not fill the space with anything unnecessary. She just held still and let the name occupy the room for a moment, given its due weight. "He sounds like he had a good name," she said gently. Seth looked at the table. His hands were folded in front of him, large and work-scarred, and he looked at them as if reading something in the lines of them. "He was 5, he said. "He would have been 12 now. He liked horses better than anything." He paused. "He would have been a good hand." Lydia's chest ached with the simple particular grief of that. "Yes," she said quietly. "I expect he would have been." She did not say anything else, and she did not go to him, because he had not asked for either comfort or closeness. But she thought about Daniel Barnett for the rest of the evening, this child she had never known and would never know, and she thought about what it costs a person to carry a loss like that without anyone to set it down with. She thought about Seth in the winter of 1875, nursing a sick wife and a sick boy. watching the fever take them both while the West Texas wind came down cold off the plains. She thought about him 3 years later, in 1878, in a horse fire she did not know the details of, coming out of it with his face changed and his life already emptied. And she thought about the 7 years between then and now, this ranch running on will and habit and the stubborn refusal to let it fall, this man alone at the head of a table that used to have other people at it. She went to sleep that night with a feeling she was careful not to name yet, because she was a practical woman, and she knew that feelings named too early can be frightened off. But she lay in the narrow bed in the room at the end of the hall and listened to the porch boards creak, as they did every evening, and she thought that the sound of them was less lonely now than it had been in the first week. May arrived with the full force of Texas spring, which meant warmth that tipped toward hot by noon and a wind that smelled of grass and rain from the south. The garden was producing well now, tomatoes setting their first fruits, peppers coming in strong, the herb bed thick with cilantro and sage, and a mint that was making territorial claims on the south corner. Lydia was out in the garden most mornings before breakfast, and Seth had begun appearing there occasionally, not to help, exactly, but to stand nearby and look at things in the way of a man reacquainting himself with something familiar. She put a cutting of the mint in a crockery jar on the kitchen windowsill, and he looked at it one morning and said, "My wife put mint on the windowsill." "Plants like the light," Lydia said, and nothing more. He reached out and rubbed a mint leaf between his fingers and smelled it, and the expression on his face was one she would remember for a long time, the soft, unguarded face of someone touching a memory gently, without flinching. Chester caused the incident that changed everything, which she should have expected, because Chester was the sort of person around whom incidents gathered naturally, not through malice but through a combination of goodwill and a lack of attention to consequences. She was in the barn on a Tuesday morning, looking for a trowel she had left on the tool shelf the previous week and which had gone missing, which was a mystery she had a suspicion related to Chester. She found it, and she also found, behind the tool shelf, a small black and white cat who had apparently very recently given birth to 4 kittens in the corner where the grain sacks were stacked. The kittens were no more than a few days old, eyes closed, making the small determined sounds of very new creatures who have not yet learned that the world requires more from them. She was crouched in the corner looking at them when she heard Seth come into the barn, and when he came around the end of the tool shelf and found her there on her knees in the corner communing with a litter of barn cats, something happened on his face that she had never seen before. He stopped. He looked at the cats. He looked at her, crouched in the hay with a trowel in one hand, apparently having a serious silent conversation with a mother cat who was eyeing them both with imperial suspicion. And something cracked open at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile yet. It was the shape that a smile makes before it has fully committed. The right side of his face, the unmarked side, lifted just slightly, and his eyes, those creekwater gray eyes, changed in a way that was sudden and complete, the way water changes when the sun hits it at a different angle. "She has been living in here for weeks," he said. "Chester has been feeding her." "Of course he has," Lydia said. "He will want to keep all 4 of them," Seth said. "Of course he will," Lydia said. The almost smile deepened, and she felt it coming the way you feel weather coming, the atmospheric change before the thing itself arrives. She said, without looking away from the kittens, "He will give them all names, and the names will be completely unsuitable, and he will be heartbroken when they grow up and stop being interested in him." "He named the 2 barn cats we already had," Seth said. "He named them Senator and Attorney General." She turned to look at him then because that was irresistible, and she caught the smile in full, and it broke over his face like something that had been held back by a dam that had finally found its weak point. And it was the most complete transformation she had ever watched happen to a human face, the scar pulling slightly at the corner but not diminishing it. Not at all, because the smile was in his eyes first, and the rest of his face was just following. She laughed. Not a polite laugh. Not a contained laugh, a real one, full and warm, rising up from the chest, because Senator and Attorney General was exactly the right kind of absurd, and it landed in her like a spark in dry grass. He watched her laugh, and his own smile deepened into something that had sound underneath it, not quite a laugh, more the vibration of one restrained by disuse, but there, undeniably, clearly there. She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and collected herself and looked at him, and the two of them looked at each other across the corner of the barn, with the new kittens making their small, insistent sounds in the hay. And something passed between them that was not nameable in single words, but had to do with recognition, the particular recognition of one person seeing clearly into another, and finding something they had not expected, and are now not sure what to do with. "He is going to name these ones something equally impossible," she said. "Inevitably," Seth said, and the word came with that half-submerged laugh still in it, and she thought, there it is. There is the man who has been standing behind all of this. Neither of them moved for a moment. The mother cat regarded them both with regal indifference. Outside the barn, the morning was going on without them. The wind in the grass, the horses at the water trough, the ordinary music of a working day, and neither of them reached for any of it. It was Seth who moved first, taking a step back from the corner and straightening his hat, and the motion was deliberate in the way of a man pulling himself back to a shape he is more certain of. "I came for the bay harness," he said. "Ruiz needs it this afternoon." "It is on the second hook, left side of the door," she said. He found it and went out, and she crouched in the corner with the kittens for another minute before she stood and followed. She did not let herself think too directly about what had just passed, because she was a practical woman, and she knew that some things need time to settle before they will bear the weight of examination. But she carried the warmth of it through the whole day, steady as a coal in her chest. Chester named the kittens deputy, judge, marshal, and with a logic no one else could quite follow, Prudence. Ruiz pointed out that naming a barn cat Prudence was perhaps optimistic. Chester said Prudence was a fine name, and he did not see the issue. Seth, at supper that evening when Chester explained the naming system, looked at Lydia across the table, and the right side of his mouth curved, just briefly, not a full smile but clearly its cousin, and Lydia kept her expression calm and steady and her eyes on her plate, and felt the thing in her chest burn a little warmer. May went on. The days lengthened and warmed and fell into a rhythm that Lydia found, to her own surprise, deeply satisfying. The satisfaction was not complicated. It was the satisfaction of useful work well done, of meals that fed people and gardens that produced, and a house that was gradually becoming less like a shell and more like a place where someone lived. But it was also something else, something that had to do with the specific shape of the days here, the way the light moved across the land outside her kitchen window, the sound of the ranch in the morning, the reliable presence of Seth Barnett in the frame of the doorway at 6 every evening. She was aware, with the clear-eyed self-knowledge that was one of her better qualities, that she was in danger of feeling something she had not planned on feeling. She was employed here. He was her employer. He was a man who had been made solitary by grief and injury and 7 years of a life that had not given him reasons to be otherwise. She was not going to make assumptions, but she was also aware, with the same clear-eyed quality, of the way things were changing. The way his eyes found her when she entered the room. The way he had begun, in the second half of May, to occasionally remain at the kitchen table after Ruiz and Chester went out, not for any stated reason, just remaining. The way their conversations had begun to have more room in them, more willingness to stay in a subject longer than strictly necessary. He asked her once what Abilene had been like, and she told him, the store, the cattle drives coming through in the seasons, the way the town changed year on year as the railroad brought new people, and the old rough edge of it smoothed down. He listened with his elbows on the table and his coffee cup between his palms, and the look of a man who has been in one place long enough that he listens to stories of elsewhere the way, Some men listen to music. She asked him once how he had come to this particular piece of land, and he told her. His father had come from Tennessee after the war, had staked out the original 80 acres in 1869, and Seth had expanded it by purchase in the 70s until it was what it was now. He had been born in Tennessee and come here as a boy, and the land had taken hold of him with the authority of a thing that is simply where you belong. He spoke about the land the way she had heard very few people speak about anything, with the quiet certainty of a man describing something essential rather than something owned. On a Saturday afternoon at the end of May, they drove to town together because she needed dry goods, and he had business with Falk regarding the finalized resolution of the water rights matter, which had proceeded as she had predicted and been settled in their favor without need of a judge. Ruiz and Chester were on the ranch, so it was the two of them in the wagon, and the drive to Harding Creek took 40 minutes by the direct road, and it was the longest uninterrupted time they had spent in each other's company, and neither of them seemed distressed by this. She bought flour, salt, dried fruit, coffee, sugar, lard, and a small brown paper packet of peppercorns that she had been wanting since she arrived. He completed his business with Falk, and Falk apparently offered congratulations and some version of the point that Price would not be likely to make further trouble, and Seth came out of the attorney's office with the unburdened look of a man who has been carrying something and has just set it down. They stopped at the dry goods counter, and she introduced him to Hob Dunnigan, who was in town that day, and who looked between them with the expression of a man who had delivered her to the ranch 6 weeks ago and was noting the changes with interest. Hob shook Seth's hand with the elaborate heartiness of someone who had opinions he was choosing not to voice, and Seth was perfectly civil, and when they were loading the wagon afterward, Seth said, without particular expression, "You know half the town, it seems." "I know Hob Dunnigan," she said. "He was kind enough to drive me out to the ranch when my coach broke down." "Did he charge you for it?" "He tried not to," she said. "I insisted." Seth looked at her sideways, the good side, the half-profile that she had come to read fluently. "You insist on a great many things," he said. "I pay my debts," she said. There was a pause, and then Seth said, so quietly she almost missed it under the sound of the team moving, "I am aware of that." She looked at him, and he was looking at the road ahead, his profile against the afternoon sky, and she thought about what he meant by that, and she chose, for the moment, to leave it unexamined. But she watched the country going by in the golden late May light, the cedar and the caliche and the long grass bending in the warm wind, and she felt something in her chest that was undeniable, and that she was beginning to think might not be in need of careful management after all. It might simply be what it was. June arrived with heat, real heat, the kind that settled over West Texas like a heavy hand and made the air shimmer above the hard ground by noon. She moved supper earlier by an hour to beat the worst of the kitchen heat, and she learned to do the heavy cooking in the morning and leave the afternoons to the garden and the lighter work. The heat brought its own kind of intimacy, the way physical discomfort strips away the extra layers people carry. Chester wore his hat constantly at new and increasingly creative angles and complained to the horses. Ruiz became quieter than usual and spent his noon break in the shade of the barn without speaking. Seth shed his canvas jacket and worked in his shirt sleeves, and the visible strength of him, the ease with which he moved through the work of the ranch, was something Lydia observed with a frankness she permitted herself on the grounds that admiring someone's capability was not the same as being impractical about it. One evening in the first week of June, she was sitting on the porch steps after supper with a bowl of string beans she was preparing for the next day, the sky going through its extraordinary performance of color in the west, when Seth came and sat on the porch railing above and beside her. He did not say anything for a while. He watched the sky with his hands loose on his knees, and she worked steadily through the beans, and the silence between them was of a kind that had nothing uncomfortable in it whatsoever. He said after a while, "I want to show you something tomorrow morning." She looked up. "What is it?" "There is a place on the North Ridge," he said. You can see most of the ranch from it, the whole valley. I thought," he paused briefly, "I thought you might like to see it." She understood this as what it was, an offering. Not a practical thing, not an item of ranch business, but something offered to her personally, with the specific knowledge that she would find it worth seeing. She felt the warmth of it move through her the way warmth moves through cold hands held near a fire. "I would like that very much," she said. They rode out the next morning at first light, while the air was still cool and the sky was the particular pale blue of Texas at dawn, not yet the deep color it would burn into by mid-morning. He had saddled the bay for her, knowing from a conversation the previous week that she could ride competently, and she pulled herself up into the saddle with the ease of someone who had been on horses since childhood, and he took the roan, and they rode north through the long grass without hurry. The ridge was a 40-minute ride, and they reached it as the sun was climbing the east horizon, and what lay before her was something that she felt in the chest the same way you feel music. The ranch spread below in the early light, the house and barn and corral small and clear at this distance, the south pasture rolling green and gold to the creek, the long north grass reaching away to the Cedar Hills. The sky above it was enormous in the way that only Texas skies are, going from the pink and gold of the horizon to the deep blue of the zenith in a single, uninterrupted sweep. And at the edge of her vision, far to the south, she could see the pale shadow of mountains. She stood in her stirrups without thinking and looked at all of it, and she heard herself breathe out something that was not quite a word. Seth was watching her look at it, and she was aware of his watching without having to turn to confirm it. "This is your land," she said, not a question, just the understanding of it, the full scale of what he had built and held and kept. "My father's first," he said, "and then mine." Daniel would have loved this view, she said softly. She had not planned to say it. It came from a feeling too direct to manage, the way true things sometimes do. She felt immediately the weight of the words in the air between them, and she turned to look at him and found him looking at her with an expression that was open in a way she had not seen his face be before, open and pained, and beneath the pain, something warmer. "Yes," he said. Just the one word, but it carried everything. She reached across the space between the horses and put her hand on his forearm briefly, the way you touch someone when words are not enough and you want them to know they are not alone. His arm was warm under her fingers and very still. He looked at her hand on his arm, and then he looked at her face, and the moment was long and held and full of things that had no language yet but were entirely clear. She drew her hand back. They looked at the valley together, and after a while he said quietly, "When I first came back here after the fire, I could not look at any of this. I came up here once and looked at it, and it seemed like something that had nothing to do with me anymore. Like I was looking at someone else's country." "And now?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the grass below them. A pair of hawks turned in the warming air. "It looks like mine again," he said. She understood, without being told, what had changed. She felt it in her chest, the weight of being someone's reason, and she accepted it not with pride but with something more like gratitude, because it mattered to her too. This land, this ranch, this difficult, guarded, quietly extraordinary man who had just told her, in the best language available to him, that she was part of the reason he could see his own life again. They rode back in the growing heat of the morning, and at the barn they unsaddled together, working around each other in the dim interior with an ease that comes from weeks of sharing space and reading each other's movements. When the horses were unhitched from their equipment and turned out to the corral, she went to hang the bridles on the wall, and when she turned back Seth was standing very close. He was looking at her with those gray eyes that she had learned to read the way you learn to read weather on an open horizon. And what she read there now was something that had been building since the first morning. She had stood beside him at the corral and said the roan was favoring his right foreleg. Something that had grown through 5 weeks of meals and mornings and silences and conversations, and one barn full of kittens named after legal officials. Something that had been finding its way toward the surface like water finding its level. "Lydia," he said, just her name, just the two syllables of it, but in his voice they had a quality that made her very still. "Seth," she said back. He raised one hand and touched her jaw, the right side of her face, with the back of his fingers, tentatively, the way you touch something you are not certain you have the right to touch, and she did not move away. She turned her face slightly into his hand, a motion so small and natural it surprised them both, and she looked up at him in the barn's warm dimness and said quietly, "You do not have to ask permission." He kissed her then, gently, with the specific gentleness of a man who has not kissed anyone in a very long time and is relearning the shape of tenderness. She kissed him back with everything she had been careful about for 5 weeks, and it was not a complicated thing. It was simply true. The way the valley from the ridge was true. The way the mint on the windowsill was true. When they separated, he kept his hand against her jaw, and she kept her hand curled against his chest where it had found its way during the kiss, and they looked at each other in the barn with the horses shifting quietly outside, and the morning going on without them, and neither of them said anything foolish or unnecessary. "I did not expect you," he said at last. "I did not expect this," she said honestly. He smiled. A real one, full and certain, the scar pulling at the corner in a way she was coming to find entirely, hopelessly dear, and his eyes warm and clear as creek water on a bright day. She thought, Hob Dunnigan was wrong. He does know how to smile. He just needed someone to give him a reason. She did not say this aloud. She kept it like the mint on the windowsill as a thing she understood and held quietly. The summer was the most beautiful season she had ever known. They were not reckless about it. They were both of them people who moved carefully, who had learned from loss and difficulty to value what was solid and earned over what was quick and bright. They did not announce anything to Chester and Ruiz, but Chester was not subtle about the noticing, and Ruiz was perceptive enough that he simply knew, and both of them had the good grace to find their enthusiasm elsewhere and let the thing develop without commentary. What they were was present to each other. Seth began staying at the kitchen table longer in the evenings, and the conversations grew, and she learned him in layers the way you learn a place. The surface first, and then the depth, and then the things underneath the depth that cannot be mapped but can only be felt. She learned that he had been educated past the frontier standard, that his father had valued books enough to pack several cases of them across the country, and that the shelf in the parlor held volumes she had not examined because she had not wanted to intrude. He invited her to use them, one evening, with the quiet directness that was his way of making gifts, and she worked her way through them in the evenings, and he sometimes asked what she was reading, and they sometimes argued about it, pleasantly, with the vigor of people who both have opinions and are discovering the pleasure of sharing them. She learned that he played the harmonica, badly and with great conviction, which she discovered on a Sunday afternoon when she was in the garden, and heard a sound from the direction of the north fence that her mind catalogued first as a distressed animal, and then revised. She found him sitting on the fence rail with the harmonica and told him with complete honesty that she had heard better, and he told her with complete equanimity that she was welcome to demonstrate. And when she said she could not play the harmonica, he said, "Then we are even," and she laughed and leaned on the fence rail and watched him play badly and loved every note of it. She learned that he was funny. Not in the performed way of men who want to be seen as witty, but in the dry, quiet, almost invisible way of a man who sees the world's absurdities clearly and sometimes cannot quite resist pointing at them. It came out in small flashes, a word, a look, a perfectly timed remark about Chester's ongoing campaign to domesticate every animal on the ranch, which now included the kittens, all 4 of which had been promoted to the bunkhouse against Seth's express wishes and Ruiz's resigned acceptance. She gathered these flashes like coins, each one a small treasure, proof of the man who had been waiting inside the silence all along. He learned her too. She felt it in how he watched her. In the questions he began asking about Abilene, about her parents, about what she had wanted and what she had thought her life would look like before it had gone the way it went. He was a careful listener, a man who paid attention without appearing to, who would return 2 days later to something she had mentioned in passing with a question that showed he had been thinking about it. It was, she found, a remarkable quality in a person. On a Sunday in late June, Mee Coulter came back with her husband Thomas and their 3 children, and the ranch had a full and boisterous midday meal that Lydia organized with the cheerful efficiency of someone who has always known how to feed a crowd. And Mee stood in the kitchen doorway watching her brother carry his nephew on his shoulders across the yard and turned to Lydia and said, very quietly, "I have not seen him do that since before." "He is a good man," Lydia said. "He is," Mee said. "He needs someone who sees that." She paused. "I think he has found her." Lydia did not argue with this. After the Coulters had gone and the supper things were put away and Chester and Ruiz had disappeared to the bunkhouse with the 4 kittens, Lydia was standing on the porch watching the evening sky, and Seth came and stood beside her. They stood side by side in the cooling air, and after a while he reached out and took her hand, quietly and certainly, and held it, and she held it back. "What do you want?" he said. Not a leading question, not a question with an intended answer, a genuine question, asked with the full attention of a man who intends to hear what she says. She thought about it. She was 26, and she had spent the last 4 years in service to her father's illness, and before that in service to the store, and she had not thought very specifically about what she wanted because the space for wanting had been occupied by what was needed. But here, on this porch, in the July-coming heat of a Texas evening with this man's hand warm around hers, she found that she knew exactly what she wanted. "This," she said simply. "This place. This work. You." He was quiet for a moment, and then he turned to look at her with an expression that was entirely open, no armor, no distance, the face of a man who has been found after being lost for a long time and is still somewhat astonished by it. "I am not easy," he said. "I know that," she said. "I have had 6 weeks of evidence." The corner of his mouth moved. "And you are still here." "I am still here," she agreed. He raised their joined hands and looked at them, and then he said, "I would like you to stay." "Is that a proposal?" she asked, keeping her voice light because she was not going to make assumptions. "It is," he said, with a directness that admitted no ambiguity. "It is a proposal. Marry me, Lydia." She looked at him in the evening light, at the scar and the gray eyes and the slight curve of his mouth that was waiting with more patience than she would have expected. And she thought of the first morning she had stood at this corral, and said the roan was favoring his right foreleg. And she thought of the barn with the kittens and the ridge with the valley and the kitchen with the blue curtains. And she thought of Daniel and the fever winter and the horse fire. And she thought of 7 years of silence breaking open into something that could hold both of them. "Yes," she said. They married in August at the end of the 2nd week in the Methodist Church in Harding Creek, which was a small and practical ceremony because they were practical people. Mee and Thomas came, and their children threw flower petals in the aisle with competitive thoroughness. Chester cried, which surprised no one who knew Chester. Ruiz stood straight and still and looked genuinely moved, which he would later deny. Hob Dunnigan came because he felt he had some stake in the proceedings, given that he had driven her out to the ranch in the first place, and he sat in the back row with his hat on his knee and the expression of a man whose predictions have proven correct. Seth Barnett looked at Lydia Atwood becoming Lydia Barnett in the plain light of that August church, with an expression on his face that she would remember for the rest of her life, complete, certain, unguarded, the face of a man who has returned to himself, and found the return was worth everything it cost. The ride back to the ranch after the ceremony was in the good wagon, cleaned up and fitted out with a pair of new cushions on the seat that Mee had brought as a wedding present, and the horses moved through the afternoon heat at a patient walk, and Lydia sat beside her husband on the wagon seat, and the sky above them was the deep, burning blue of a Texas August afternoon, and he held the reins in one hand and her hand in the other, and neither of them felt any need to fill the silence, because the silence was full. That first year of their marriage was the education of 2 people learning how to be in the same life together, not the falling in love part, which was already done, but the deeper and more interesting work of building something that would last. There were adjustments on both sides. Seth was a man of strong habits, and she was a woman of strong opinions, and the combination produced occasional friction that they managed partly through real argument. Not cruelty, but the vigorous clash of two people who think clearly and trust each other enough to disagree, and partly through the kind of patient generosity that is the actual building material of a life shared. She learned that he needed his mornings alone, the first 2 hours of light before the workday began, and she gave those to him without resentment because she understood they were the hours in which he maintained the quiet that kept him steady. He learned that she needed to feel competent in her work, that being helped without being consulted was something she found frustrating, and he learned to ask her first, which cost him something because he was a man accustomed to doing things himself. She kept the accounts. She expanded the garden to a size that made Chester's eyes go wide, and produced enough tomatoes in September that she put up 40 jars of sauce and 30 of salsa, which lined the pantry shelf with a satisfying weight of abundance. She wrote to me regularly and me wrote back, and the friendship between the two women became one of the genuine pleasures of her life. Ruiz gave notice in October. He was going back to San Antonio, he said, to deal with the land question that had been unresolved since his father's time. He had found an attorney who would take the case. He told them this at supper with the careful dignity of a man who has made a difficult and important decision, and Seth shook his hand with both hands clasped around Ruiz's, and said he was sorry to lose him and glad for him in the same breath. Lydia hugged him, which he allowed with the slightly surprised expression of someone not quite accustomed to being hugged, and told him the door was open if he came back this way. Chester cried again. They hired a new hand in November, a quiet older man named Elias Webb who had come up from the border country, with good references and better skills than his modest manner suggested. He and Seth had an immediate practical understanding, the kind that develops between men who see work the same way, and Elias settled into the ranch like a person who had found the right-sized space after a long time in spaces that did not fit. The winter was mild enough. They sat by the parlor fire on cold evenings, her reading and him doing the accounts, or sometimes just sitting with a stillness that had nothing unhappy in it, the comfortable stillness of a man who is at home. She told him once that she thought he was the most contented-looking man she had ever seen when he was just sitting, and he looked at her with those gray eyes and said, "I have reason to be," and she thought she might burst with the simple adequacy of that, the way it was enough and more than enough. Spring came back around, and with it the garden and the new kittens. Prudence had made further contributions to the barn population, which Chester found magnificent and Elias found practically concerning, and the ordinary miraculous return of green things after the brown. She was in the garden one April morning, almost a full year after she had first arrived at this ranch with 2 trunks and $11.40, and she stood up from the bed she was weeding and put her hands in the small of her back and stretched, and looked at the house and the barn and the spring sky above the ridge, and she felt the fullness of it move through her like the first warm wind after cold. Seth came around the corner of the house with a bucket of water for the garden and stopped when he saw her standing there looking at the sky, and he looked at her the way he always looked at her, with that particular attention that was also warmth, the look of a man who cannot quite believe his luck and is grateful for it every day, and she said to him, from across the garden, "I have something to tell you." He set the bucket down and came to her, and she watched his face as she told him, watched the stillness break open into something that was not surprise exactly, but something bigger, recognition, maybe, or the word that lives on the other side of grief when something new decides to live. He put his hands on either side of her face carefully, the way you hold something precious, and he looked at her with those gray eyes full of everything he had learned to feel again, everything she had given him back the space to feel, and he said, "A child." "Yes," she said. In the autumn, I think." He kissed her, and when he pulled back he was smiling with his whole face, fully, freely, without reservation, and she thought for the thousandth time that Hob Dunnigan had been entirely wrong. This man had always known how to smile. It had just been waiting for something worth smiling at. "Me is going to be insufferable about it," she said. "Completely," he agreed, and looked insufferably happy himself. And she laughed and he laughed with her, both of them standing in the April garden with the warm wind moving the new grass and the sky burning blue above them, and the life they had made together going on in all directions as far as the eye could see. Chester heard the news at supper and genuinely wept, which was unprecedented even for Chester, and then immediately began proposing names, none of which were suitable. Elias shook hands with Seth and nodded to Lydia with the respectful warmth of a man who has been made briefly a part of someone else's joy and is glad for it. Seth opened the bottle of whiskey he kept on the high shelf and poured small glasses for the table, including Lydia, who took half a measure and raised it and said nothing because nothing needed saying. The baby was born in October of 1883, in the room at the end of the hall that was now a room she shared with Seth, rather than the spare room she had first occupied. And me came and stayed for a week before and 2 weeks after, which was the kind of help that cannot be paid for and can only be accepted with deep and genuine gratitude. The birth was hard. It ran a long day and into a long night, and Seth paced the porch outside in a way that Chester later said had worn a new groove in the boards, and when me opened the door and told him he had a son, he stopped pacing so completely it was like a man being bolted to the earth. He went in. He went to Lydia, who was exhausted and bright-eyed and propped against the pillows with the weight of the small person in her arms, and he sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his hands, and he held his son with the careful, absolute attention of a man holding something for which he has no adequate measure. "He has your eyes," she said. He looked up at her and she saw the tears on his face, unashamed and complete, and she reached out and put her hand against his cheek. The scarred side gently, and he closed his eyes for a moment and then opened them again and looked at the baby and then at her. "Daniel," he said quietly. A question and a statement at once. She had thought about this for months without telling him. She had sat with it and turned it over and measured it from every side, and every time she came back to the same answer. "Daniel," she said, "if you want." "I want," he said. Daniel Seth Barnett came into the world in the October of 1883, small and loud and entirely determined to make his presence known from the first breath, which, as Seth observed with a dry, quiet certainty, he had clearly inherited from his mother. Lydia told him she would remember that remark. He said she probably would. The years that followed were full in the way that a good life is full, not without difficulty, because difficulty is part of everything honest, but with a richness that grows from people and work and love, and the daily practice of showing up for all three. The ranch prospered, not dramatically but steadily, which was the better kind of prosperity, the kind that does not depend on luck but on the accumulated intelligence of people who know their land and their work. Seth expanded the herd in 1884 and again in 1885. Lydia took over the books completely and managed the household accounts with an efficiency that Seth told Falk, the attorney, was better than most commercial operations he had seen, which Falk conveyed back to her with the air of a man delivering a significant compliment second-hand. Elias Webb stayed on for 3 years and then retired to his daughter's family in Del Rio with a good farewell meal and the assurance that if he ever needed work the door was open. Chester, to no one's great surprise, eventually married a girl from Harding Creek named Anna Brecken, who was patient and sensible and clearly managed Chester with the equanimity of someone who had been prepared by nature for exactly this task. They settled on a small place a few miles from the Barnett spread, and Chester became one of the reliable presences at the ranch that you did not employ, but on whom you could count when something needed doing, and an extra set of capable hands was required. Ruiz sent a letter in 1884. He had settled the land case, incompletely but meaningfully. He had recovered 20 acres of the original property, which was not the whole of what had been taken but was something real and solid, something to stand on. He was ranching it. He was well. The letter was written with the careful satisfaction of a man who has done a thing that needed doing, and Lydia read it to Seth at the supper table, and he listened with the expression of a man quietly glad for someone else's persistence, and said he hoped Ruiz knew he had earned it, and Lydia wrote back to say exactly that. Me and Thomas came at Christmas every year and sometimes other times too, and me and Lydia sat at the kitchen table through long autumn evenings and talked the way women talk when they trust each other completely, about everything and nothing, about their children and their husbands and the work and the land and the enormous complicated ordinary gift of being alive in a place that was theirs. Daniel grew. He was loud and curious and fearless in the exact proportion of a child who has been loved completely, and therefore believes the world is basically well-disposed toward him. And he was on a horse before he was 4, and following his father around the ranch like a small, extremely vocal shadow before he was 5. Seth watched his son with an expression that never stopped having wonder in it, the ongoing astonishment of a man who had once lost everything and has been given back something he did not think the world would offer twice. He was a good father. He was present and patient in ways that his natural temperament would not have predicted, but his love had made necessary. And he learned that small children require from you not just presence, but a kind of interested willingness to enter their world. And he entered it with the same focused attention he brought to everything. And the result was a boy who idolized his father with a completeness that was almost alarming to witness. Lydia had a second child in the spring of 1886, a girl they named Clara Me for obvious reasons, and the Clara from Lydia's mother, whose name deserved carrying forward. Clara came into the world with considerably more dispatch than Daniel had, and less ceremony, and turned out to be a person of formidable opinions and notable cheerfulness, which Seth said was an exact reproduction of her mother, and Lydia said was a significant exaggeration. And Daniel, aged 3, told the baby very seriously that the horses were outside and he would show her when she was bigger. And the land grew around all of them, as land does, unhurried and indifferent to human calendars and human grief, but shaped in its small ways by the people who worked it and loved it and called it their own. The garden that had been overgrown and abandoned when Lydia arrived was by the late 1880s a serious and productive enterprise that supplied the household through most of the year and traded surplus with neighbors. The blue curtains in the kitchen window were replaced twice as they wore, and each time she sewed new ones in the same blue because it was the right color for that window and for that light. The scar on Seth Barnett's face remained what it was, and she had ceased long ago to see it as separate from the face it was part of, the face she knew better than any face in the world, the face she could read across a yard or a room or a field with the accuracy of long intimacy. She had kissed that scar so many times it had its own significance in the inventory of him, a part of the landscape of a person she loved the way she loved this land, not despite its harsh edges but including them, because the harsh edges were part of what made the whole thing real. He had learned to smile so fluently that it seemed impossible anyone had ever suggested he could not. It was quiet in the way his nature was quiet, not the broad public smile of a gregarious man, but the specific, certain smile of a man who knows what he has and is glad of it. It appeared most reliably in the presence of his children, and in the presence of his wife, and occasionally in the presence of animals in situations he found absurd, which was a category that remained well stocked as long as Chester Webb kept his habit of befriending things. And sometimes in the evenings, when the work was done and the children were asleep and the porch was quiet under the stars, he sat beside her in the dark and she heard him hum. Not quite a song, not quite nothing, the involuntary music of a man so entirely at peace with his life that his contentment had sound. She never told him she heard it. She kept it the way she kept all the small, specific, tender things, privately, preciously, as the evidence of something real that would not be made more real by being named aloud. Years later, when Daniel was tall and working beside his father on the ranch that would one day be his, and Clara was sharp-tongued and bright-eyed and already better at the account books than anyone but her mother, and the land was good, and the cattle were fat, and the autumn sky was burning its familiar extraordinary colors in the west, Lydia stood on the porch and watched Seth and Daniel at the corral. The man and the young man side by side on the fence rail, watching the horses the way Seth had been watching them on the day she arrived. And she thought about Hob Dunnigan's warning on the road from town, how long ago it seemed, and how completely wrong it had turned out to be. She had been told the scarred rancher never smiled. She had made him laugh before the horses were unhitched. And then she had stayed, and they had built this life together out of practical conversation and good cooking and blue curtains, and an account book, and a barn full of kittens with impossible names, out of a ridge with a view of a valley, and a name said aloud in a quiet kitchen, and a hand held on an evening porch, out of trust accumulated in small increments, until it had the weight and strength of something that could hold two people and their children and their grief and their joy and the wide, unapologetic West Texas land they loved. Seth turned from the corral and saw her on the porch and raised one hand in a greeting that was also, she knew, an invitation. She came down the porch steps and crossed the yard and went to stand beside him at the fence, and he put his arm around her shoulders with the easy certainty of a man who has spent years practicing being certain of one particular thing. And the three of them stood together in the evening light watching the horses, and the land went on in all directions, and the sky was enormous and burning and theirs. "Tomorrow morning," Daniel said, with the conversational confidence of a young man who has grown up being listened to, "I want to take the roan out to the north pasture and see about the fence line the way you showed me." "The roan favors his right foreleg in cold weather," Seth said. "I know," Daniel said. "I will watch for it." Seth looked at Lydia and she looked at him, and neither of them said a word about the first morning, because they did not need to, because the whole of it was here in this moment, and in every moment they had made and would continue to make on this land under this sky with these people who were the shape and substance of everything either of them had ever needed, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. The stars came out over West Texas in their millions, indifferent and magnificent, and below them the Barnett Ranch lay quiet and warm and alive, the house with its lamplight in the windows and its blue curtains and its kitchen smelling of supper and sage, the barn with its horses and its ongoing kitten population, the garden winter bare but with the bulbs of the spring already waiting underground, patient and certain, ready to come back as they always did, the green things, returning.